The Devil's Work. Book 1 in the Mel Goes to Hell series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. Do we have a deal? The rich tone rolled off his tongue like his first morning espresso, waking up the man in front of him more effectively than the coffee hit he so ardently craved. A deal? Richard Toller squeaked, then cleared his throat in an attempt to sound like a man and not a teenager caught masturbating by his mum. Yes, where you sign that and we commence our mutually beneficial relationship. Luce flashed impossibly perfect teeth. Yet anything but perfection would be out of place, from his sleek dark hair to black shoes so shiny Toller fancied he could see his own reflection in them. Toller tried to focus on the paper before him, but the words seemed to blur. Perhaps he shouldn't have had that glass of whiskey before the meeting, or the 2 others he'd downed to hide his discomfort at being in this meeting. Never mind. Toller knew he wanted what this man could give him, and to hell with the price he paid for it. In exchange for your significant campaign contributions and your invaluable assistance in getting me re-elected, I propose to keep your company's interests foremost in my mind when voting or proposing any new policy or legislation. Toller ventured a smile. Like your own legal guardian angel. Luce smiled, but it didn't seem to reach his dark eyes. Eyes like 2 black holes, sucking a man in so that he couldn't escape. Toller blinked and shook his head. What exactly does your company do, Mr. Iblis? Luce never moved, but Toller had the sudden impression of fangs instead of teeth in a very different smile. My company has many diverse interests throughout the world. We fund projects and individuals we feel will further our global interests, Luce said. Toller nodded. So you're angel investors? Luce chuckled. You might say that. Investors who expect to see a return from our investment, in the long term. He folded his hands. I'm not impatient, Treasurer Toller, but I most definitely expect a return from you. Toller shivered in a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the warm room. I had my staff prepare a summary of what I propose for my next term in office. That way, you can draw my attention to anything I might need to consider before I stand up in Parliament to discuss it. He pushed the folder across the desk, where it drew the fathomless gaze of the businessman before him. Toller wished he had the courage to ask him who tailored his suits, for they were impeccably made, like everything else about Luce Iblis. Sign it. The words seemed to issue from the very air, hissing their irresistible command. Toller glanced at the contract again. The pen was already in his hand, and it was but the work of a moment to scrawl his signature across the bottom. He sagged in his seat, relieved as the pen slipped from his fingers and rolled across the desk. Luce Iblis caught it. Thank you. He snatched up the contract, signed it, then tucked it into the folder with Toller's plans. He rose. My staff will be in touch. Toller shivered again, more violently this time. He really needed to get someone to look at the air conditioning in his office. No, scratch that. With this campaign money and all the government assets he intended to sell off once he was re-elected, he'd be able to afford to build a new office. He might even take the rest of the day off. Never mind that it was only 10 in the morning. His wife would be at work, so he could call his mistress and spend the rest of the day in bed. Celebrating. For this was the most profitable day's work he'd ever done. 2. You will never know the domination of earth or heaven. Your realm will be hell and the boundaries of your rule. Fall demon. You have no dominion here or on earth. No one will help you now. Luce felt his body plummeting through darkness. The cold cling of cloud, the furious rush of wind, weightlessness in his limbs, yet still he fell. His body burned as if cloven in 2 by the sword before it was torn free, but this became his only feeling as the icy plunge took his sense of touch along with his sight. He heard the air scream past, though he couldn't summon the breath to scream. He could taste his own blood like tar in his throat and wished the torment would end. Wonderful. Now he was having flashbacks about his first fall from heaven. Luce waited impatiently for the memory to fade enough for reality to return. Luce detested the falling sensation in elevators. It put him in mind of other, less pleasant memories than the satisfying victory that should be uppermost in his mind at the moment. But the devil's work was never done, so he opened the folder and skimmed through the contents. It was everything he'd hoped it would be and more. Making the man sell his soul in the bargain had hardly been necessary. Dick Toller already had a place reserved in hell, and no damned soul had ever been redeemed in the 5,000 years Luce had been running the place. 5,000 years was a long time in one job though, and it was time the Lord of Hell branched out a little. Maybe to take over Earth as well. Once he held dominion over Earth and Hell, maybe he could even take on Heaven, and prove those smug bastards Michael and Raphael wrong. 3. Explain to me again why this plan will work while every other one has failed, Luce commanded, propping his feet up on his desk as he leaned back in his chair. He admired the fit of his tailored suit pants on this rather delectable human body. Even if he wasn't about to become the CEO of what would one day be the most successful corporation on Earth, no man or woman would be able to resist him. Hell, he was having trouble resisting himself. No wonder he had trouble focusing on whatever Mephistopheles was saying. Mephistopheles gave a long-suffering sigh and rolled her eyes. If you'd listened the first or even the second time, we'd be finished already, and you'd be halfway through the selection of sinners sent up from level 2 today. Luce's eyes lit up. Halfway? You mean there aren't many new ones today? Perhaps I could deal with them first and we could reschedule this meeting for another time. Like never. Mephistopheles slammed her tablet on the table, her eyes glowing red with anger to match her suit. She'd evidently employed the same tailor for her suits as his, for it outlined her feminine curves to perfection. It will only work if we follow all the rules, something you've never bothered to do before. You get distracted, break the rules, and the angels win. That's why you fail. Try as he might, Luce couldn't remember what her body felt like. He cast his memory back, trying to recall when he'd last summoned her to his chamber. Or had he simply backed her up against one of the cave walls? There were plenty here in hell after all. Maybe he should refresh his memory by bending her over this desk. That's how most of the CEOs in level 2 damn their souls through lust. Employing a sexy secretary and bending her to his will. When did we last have sex, Mephistopheles? He asked. She'd know. She remembered every detail. All the meaningless minutiae, the conditions on every contract. Those red eyes chilled until they were almost the emotionless gray of an angel. For there to be a last time, there would have to be a first time, and that will never happen. Unless by some miracle you manage to return us to heaven, and then I may consider changing my mind. But only if Beelzebub can watch. Her little grin was definitely devilish. Ah yes. Mephistopheles did have that strange preference for Beelzebub. Luce would never understand it. When faced with such magnificence, how could anyone choose second or even third best? Help me to conquer heaven, and you and Beelzebub may join me there for a threesome, Luce declared. Of all the demons under him, he found Mephistopheles the hardest to read. Especially when she gave him one of her puzzled looks, like now. Finally she said, never mind heaven yet. Focus on Earth. On humans and human rules. Luce snorted. Humans don't have rules. Not really. They're more like guidelines that change to suit whoever is in power in a particular place and time. And plenty of people disobey them, or hell wouldn't be as full as it is. Mephistopheles took a deep breath, as if she was trying to practice that particularly angelic virtue, patience. Ha! Maybe she really did want to go back to heaven. A couple thousand years ago, some angel told a bunch of humans that they had to follow the same rules on Earth as they did in heaven, plus all the human rules. The only problem is both he and the humans were drinking, and the message came out kind of garbled. One of the humans was a scribe and wrote it down so we know what was said instead of what was meant. So for the last 2,000 years, at least one of the religions has preserved this in their holy writings. So millions of humans now believe that whatever rules they made here on Earth, angels have to abide by. We've used it to win countless souls, as angels can't break human contracts even when they make them with us. Luce nodded. I know all this. You write the contracts, a human and demon sign them, then we wait for the human to drop dead. We get their soul, they get eternal servitude in hell. I admit I've always found it more fun to tempt them into damning their soul without the extra paperwork. Mephistopheles frowned. But there's always a chance they might redeem themselves later, and you'll lose that soul. Whereas with an unbreakable contract. Luce shrugged. How many manage that? Really? Can you name one? Mephistopheles' frown deepened. There's a list of canonized saints. I'm sure I could name a few for you. There was Patrick, an escaped slave who returned to his enslavers to save their souls. George, a guy who let a maiden die as bait so he could kill some reptile that was menacing a whole town. If you really want the list. Luce waved it away. No, I don't need some crumbling list out of the Vatican archives. Besides, there can't be more than 1,000. In 2,000 years. That's not even one person a year, out of how many millions? And not all those were mine either. There are far more pleasurable things to do to maidens than feed them to crocodiles, so I don't think I met your George. Patrick though, I think I met him once. Tried to tempt him, but the angels had their claws in him already by then. Like they were trying to prove there was one human soul fit for heaven. Never did learn which angel got to him. Not my problem anymore. Let the angels try to keep heaven in balance, with all those humans in there with them. One day they'll realize how hard it is, and then they'll come running to me. He stopped as he realized Mephistopheles was now engrossed in something on her tablet, ignoring him. Am I boring you? He snapped. Mephistopheles looked up. Oh, are you finished already? That was quick. And, do you really still think that plan will work? I mean, it's been millennia. Angels never were a particularly bright bunch. I was the brightest of them, and look what happened. They threw me out. All the more reason to try something else while I'm waiting. I'll show them. I'll show them all. Especially that Michael. Relief relaxed Mephistopheles' features. Yes, about that something else. The new plan, where we own the governments of the world. It's big, it's ambitious, but it might not be enough. I mean, the world has changed. Not all countries are ruled by monarchies or dictatorships. There are elections every year or 3, and the government changes. In order to own every government all of the time, we'd be working non-stop, and we'd need signed contracts for every soul because we couldn't risk losing even one. We'd need senior demons watching every government on the planet, in case of changes. Demons who can blend in among humans without breaking any of their rules and drawing attention to themselves. Luce shrugged. Then I guess I'll promote a few demons. Tell them if they fail, they'll be sent to level 8 for a century or 2. That should motivate them and maybe even get us some more staff for level 8. He glanced up to find Mephistopheles' gaze fixed on him. What? He asked. I've promoted demons before. And punished them. This will work. But you'll have to obey the rules too if you mean to be the company's CEO. You'll be in the public eye all the time. You'll have to behave. He shrugged again. Behaving like a CEO is easy. We have enough of them in hell. I know exactly what they do, Luce assured her. Easy, I swear. Of course it would be. Because if it involved hard work, no self-respecting devil would do it. You'll have to remember the ones about sexual harassment. And drugs. And smoking. And the ones about occupational health and safety. Lucifer tuned her out, as he daydreamed about doing all the things he'd condemned CEOs to hell for. Oh, this was going to be fun. 4. The gates of hell yawned before their Lord, as if they didn't care about losing him to the human world for a while. Well, they were made of rock, the rusty color of dried blood, a natural quirk of Nullarbor geology that he found particularly suitable for such a place. But if rock were to soften for anyone, surely it would melt for the hot devil in a suit as he stood before them. Yet nothing. Lucifer reached up to finger the deeply carved letters. All hope abandon ye, who enter here. The desert sun had warmed the stone so that it might blister a man's fingers, but Lucifer was so much more than a man. He had no need to heed the warning, meant to frighten the souls who entered, never to leave. He was leaving with a plan far superior to mere hope. The bad luck that had plagued him for 5 millennia would end now. His car baked in the sun. Inside, the air was hotter than the desert sands, but that didn't bother the devil. He twisted the key, and was rewarded with an angry growl from the engine beneath the black hood. He only had to wait a moment before air conditioning blasted his hair back, working hard to chill the car's interior to the same frosty temperature as his climate-controlled office in hell. Humans talked of hell freezing over when they would do all the things they didn't dare do, when in fact the lowest level of hell had been frozen for as long as Lucifer could remember. Longer, maybe. Which was why he was all for satisfying desires immediately, without waiting. Grinning, Lucifer stomped on the accelerator, leaving a cloud of red dust behind him as he headed for the highway. Humans might call it the highway to hell, and for them it was, but for him, it was the ultimate escape. The speed, the longest straight stretch of road in Australia, and nothing to get in his way. Definitely no high and mighty angel, like Michael and his mates. This was why he'd picked Perth, Western Australia, as a starting point for this enterprise. No angels bothered coming to such an isolated capital city, if they even knew it existed. Even if they did, 2 million souls were enough to hide him. That and the innocuous company name he'd finally agreed upon with Mephi, Soulcorp. He'd wanted to hold out for the Hell Corporation, after thinking up 100 acronyms for hell, but it was best not to draw the angels' attention too early, or they might find a way to stop him. Not a hope in hell, he told himself, gunning the engine. The speedometer said the car could do 200, and he was curious to see how much further he could push it. After all, it wasn't like there'd be any other traffic on the road between Nowhere and Dullsville. He'd been driving for an hour, not seeing so much as another car going the other way, when his favorite Rolling Stones song came up on his playlist, and he considered putting the car on cruise control so he could concentrate on singing along. He might be the devil and damned to hell, but he still had a singing voice that made angels weep. Humans too, when he wanted them to. Though it had been some time since he'd sung anything. Hell did that to him, he supposed. Definitely time for a stint on the surface then. Maybe he could give one of those singing reality shows a go, if he got bored. When this project had a strong enough hold on the country, and it was safe to let angels know he was in Australia. Since when did the devil care about caution? He did what he liked and damn the consequences. Or anyone who got in his way. Especially on the highway. As if the playlist could read his mind, Lucifer's favorite AC/DC song began. Time to see how much more than 200 this car could do. Something orange flashed up ahead. He thought he'd imagined it, but then he saw it again. An orange flashing light. Like someone was doing roadwork in the arse end of nowhere. It was his eternal bad luck at work. The only time in a decade he'd seen a road crew on air highway, and it had to be here to slow him down. But it wouldn't stop him, he swore. Within moments he'd found the source of the blinking light, a white van with a big yellow sign proclaiming it was a pilot. He swerved to the far side of the road, intending to overtake, before swerving back into his lane again, swearing loudly. In front of the van were 3 semi-trailers, hauling enormous mining trucks that took up both lanes. And ahead of them stretched the tantalizing stretch of straight road, not quite wide enough to overtake for what Lucifer knew would be at least 100 miles. He slowed to match the truck's speed, gritting his teeth as he was forced to amble along at a measly 40 kilometers per hour. Lucifer had watched limbless sinners crawl across spike-filled pits faster than this. If he transformed into his horned, demonic form, surely that would frighten the drivers enough to speed up. After 10 minutes, enduring the cramped quarters with his horns mashed against the ceiling and his knees wedged uncomfortably under his chin, Lucifer gave up. Even his car wasn't made for his devilish might. And whoever was driving the pilot vehicle was evidently oblivious to the driver behind him, or the trucks couldn't go any faster. Somewhere an angel was laughing at him, he was certain of it. He retracted his claws from the steering wheel and shrank into the sexy human CEO form once more, smoothing his suit before flipping his middle finger at the invisible, watching angel. He knew torture better than any angel alive, and he could endure more than any untouched angel. He'd survived his fall from heaven, and this was nothing compared to that. One day, when he'd conquered heaven and found out who'd done this to him, he'd show them pain. He could bide his time until then. An hour crawled by, followed by 3 more. Lucifer lost count of the number of times he considered turning back and heading back to hell, but he hung on grimly to his steering wheel, wishing he dared to break out his wings and fly. It would be faster, at least until his wings got tired, but then he'd want to drive again. And while a demon squeezed into the driver's seat of the car behind them might go unnoticed, he was pretty sure an enormous flying demon carrying a black Jeep would definitely get the truck driver's attention. Once the video hit the internet, and it would, he knew, the angels would be all over him. So no flying today. Just crawling along the highway, praying to himself probably, that this would all be worth it in the end. If it wasn't, he was going to buy the company that made these trucks and force them to change the design so they could at least match the speed limit sign taunting him that he could be doing 110. This world would be a much better place by the time he was done with it, Lucifer swore. 5. The summer sun baked the pavement to perfection as Lucifer pulled into his parking space behind the new SolCorp office. He'd expected a high-rise office tower in the CBD, but this place had started life as a house, and it still had the wraparound veranda with a tin roof, tucked between apartment blocks. He strode in through the open door. "Mephi," he shouted. "You're going to have to find me somewhere to sleep that's closer to the office. I've just had the commute from hell and—" Mephi appeared before him. Like a woman stepping out of a doorway, which she had. Good thing the investment advisor who owned this place lived here after his wife left him then. Half the office is living quarters, while the rest is your office and reception. She waved at the leather couches behind Lucifer before lowering her voice. "Oh, and keep it quiet on the hell stuff. There are lawyers on one side of us, but the other is a guest house run by a convent. Priests, nuns, monks, all sorts come and stay there. One of them might know an angel or how to get word to one that we're here." Lucifer nodded. In the past, convents had been easy hunting grounds for him, plenty of women who hadn't wanted to be there, willing to do anything for a way out. Now, he suspected Mephi's assessment was more accurate. "Where's the investment advisor?" Lucifer asked. Mephi smiled with all her teeth, a sight that made most men quail. He suddenly felt the urge to take up early retirement in a non-extradition country. He'd already sold his soul in exchange for being acquitted of some rather damning embezzlement charges, so when his wife filed for divorce, he was happy to hand over this house in exchange for a little help leaving the country. I'm still waiting to see if I can win the ex-wife's soul too. I haven't worked out if she hates him enough to want to try and chase him down. I'm not sure she knows he's left the country yet, but this is the first place she'll come looking. Mephi never lost an opportunity to sign up more souls for hell. And you're not worried about the neighbors knowing? Luce asked. Mephi shrugged. It's what we always do. If by some miracle an angel turns up, it'll sound like the perfect cover story. They can call in the warrior angels to save the wife's soul while we take over the world. It sounded good to him. So where do we start? He asked. She beckoned him through to his office, where the walls were covered with bright paintings of the Australian desert, people playing cricket, with buildings in the background built around the same time as the house. Lucifer stepped closer to scrutinize a painting that showed a mining town, the red soil and pits in the background reminding him of hell. One of ours? He asked. The art came with the house. So yes, Mephi said before his question truly sank in. Oh, you mean the artist? No, I don't think we hold a contract for his soul. Pity. We could have commissioned some artwork for the wall in the senior demon's common room. Or even your office. Lucifer grunted. He didn't need art for his office, this one or the one in hell. Demons would definitely deface it in a day. It was what they did. Dick Toller the treasurer has been pestering me for an appointment with you, so I'll set one up for tomorrow, Mr. Iblis, Mephi said, giving a little nod to the nameplate on his desk. Luce Iblis, Chief Executive Officer, it said. Lucifer grinned. He liked it. 6. Luce gave his name at the front desk, and couldn't keep the smile off his face when a secretary in a short skirt and tight top came to escort him up to Treasurer Toller's office. How come you didn't have one of those waiting on my desk yesterday? He asked Mephi, nodding at the secretary. She frowned. Because of the sexual harassment laws. You can't say things like that, Mr. Iblis. It's not how things are done here. He opened his mouth to name 100 CEOs in hell, who had done dozens of secretaries just like this one. Mephi shot him a dark look. How do you think they got where they are? Evidently she'd read his mind. Or she knew him too well. A few millennia working together in hell would do that. Don't get distracted. Remember why we're here, she hissed as she stepped out of the elevator, blocking Luce's view of the secretary's backside. Right. Taking over the world, not taking Toller's secretary on the desk. Or up against the wall. She led the way to a meeting room, gesturing for Mephi and Luce to precede her. Then she followed them in and closed the door. The secretary marched to the head of the table and claimed her seat. Mephi blinked, shuffling her papers to hide her consternation, but Luce merely smiled. Please sit down, the secretary said. Her cold eyes indicated the words carried the force of an order. Luce didn't take his eyes off her as he slid easily into a seat that gave him a good view of the girl he suspected was far more than a secretary. Where's Mr. Toller? Mephi asked. The not-a-secretary's smile would have sat happily on any demon's face, yet he knew this girl was all human. Treasurer Toller is away on business at the moment. A state treasurer's meeting over in the eastern states. But he insisted I meet with you even without him, to tell you about his privatization plans. The not-a-secretary frowned, as if she didn't agree with her boss. Luce leaned back in his seat, folding his arms as he issued a challenge he knew this ambitious girl couldn't resist. Who are you and what do you know about my plans with Dick? She didn't even blink at the double entendre. Oh, she was good. She'd make a lovely demon too. I'm Sammy Gina Hardy, Treasurer Toller's Chief of Staff. Nothing happens in this office without my knowledge, she said with a shrug. We've just released the first call for expressions of interest for privatizing our detention facilities. Treasurer Toller was adamant that I make you aware of the opportunity and the relevant deadlines. Send them all to my assistant here, Luce said, gesturing at Mephi. I'm sure your office has her details. He rose, adjusting his pants that had grown uncomfortably tight. All on account of Sammy Gina Hardy, of course. I had one of my assistants print off a set of briefing documents so that I could take you through them personally, Sammy Gina said. As if on cue, two conservatively dressed staffers came in with papers and coffee. Mephi had half risen from her seat, but she sat down again with a sigh. Luce followed suit. Luce let his mind wander while the two women discussed the documents. He flipped through the pages, but contracts, criteria and conditions were more Mephi's thing than his. When Sammy Gina looked his way though, he made sure to smile. Finally the briefing was done, and Sammy Gina led them to the lifts. Mr. Iblis, the bathrooms are that way. I'll take your assistant down to the lobby, then return for you when you're done, Sammy Gina said. Her eyes darted down to his pants. You did look quite uncomfortable in the meeting room, she said in way of explanation. He'd lost his heart-on some time ago, but something in her tone made him to decide to head for the bathroom anyway, if only to wash his hands. 7. He found Sammy Gina waiting for him when he returned. Seconds after she pressed the button to summon the elevator, it appeared. Luce let her enter first before forcing himself to step inside. He gritted his teeth, determined not to show his discomfort at the descent. I hate elevators, she said. He unhooked his jaw enough to admit, me too. Then that sinking feeling started. So boring. She hit one of the buttons on the wall. The sinking feeling stopped. Luce opened his eyes. Sammy Gina grinned. Would you like to make the ride interesting, or are you afraid of what your assistant will think? She began to unbutton her shirt. Luce watched, not saying a word. Just enjoying the show. It's not harassment if both parties are willing, consenting adults and neither holds power over the other, she said, inching her skirt up over her thighs. More like the satisfaction of mutual desires. Luce couldn't help it. He grinned. This was his kind of woman. As she wrapped her legs around his hips, bringing her lips close enough to kiss, he reflected that she probably thought he was her kind of man. Maybe just for this ride. 8. What took you so long? Mephi asked irritably, staring up at Luce from her desk. I stopped for a bite to eat, he said. It was almost the truth. He could still taste Sammy Gina on his tongue. Well, this proposal thing will take more time than I thought. It's not just a straight buyout, like we thought it would be. The government would pay us for doing their job for them, and they want proof we know what we're doing. Examples of experience in similar things. Cost estimates. We wouldn't just be buying the government. We'd be running it. She tapped the paper with her finger, then looked up at him again. If this works, it could be far more effective than owning the politicians. They get elected every few years, but the government departments stick around in one form or another, forever. I'd have to check it more thoroughly, but this could be the way to take over the world. Wasn't that what they were doing anyway? Whatever. Keep going. World domination, here we come, he said vaguely, heading for the bathroom. His bathroom, where there was a shower. Oh, Sammy Gina had licked him clean afterwards, but he still felt a little dirty after what they'd done. At least he'd never dread going down in an elevator again. 9. Right, I'm ready to submit this. Can you read it through one more time to make sure it's ready? Mephi asked. I wish you had time to run it by Treasurer Toller's office again, but the deadline's in less than an hour. If he had to read her expression of interest, more like an expression of how boring business communications could be, one more time, he'd go mad. The various versions she'd given him over the last few weeks had given him plenty of excuses to pop up to Sammy Gina's office to hear her thoughts on the prison proposal. He was pretty sure they'd had sex on top of the proposal at one point, because it had been on the desk. He wasn't sure what tantalized him more, that she still possessed her own soul without surrendering it to him, or that her sexual appetites surpassed that of most demons. But less than an hour wouldn't be enough time to satisfy the tempting chief of staff who insisted on being addressed as Miss Hardy, so Luce would have to forego that pleasure for today. "It's fine," Luce said. "Just send it. I'm going to get lunch." The food here was a definite improvement on what had been available in hell. With a plethora of restaurants, cafes and lunch bars servicing the myriad offices around, Luce was spoilt for choice, in both the food and the charms of the servers. He chose ambrosia today, a patisserie that made the most heavenly pastries he'd ever tasted, savory or sweet. If he hadn't spent several evenings entertaining the pastry chefs, he might have worried that they were all angels. But even Damon Angelo, the owner, had a carnal streak no angel could fake. Luce could definitely vouch for that. Not to mention the man's stamina. "What would you like, sir?" Luce blinked. The server was talking to him. He pointed to his selections, grinning in anticipation at his decadent lunch. Being the devil did have its good points. It took 2 hands to carry the box outside, and he nodded his thanks to the man who held the door open for him. A man in a white suit, of all things. The sort of suit worn by tourists in the tropics, or madmen on their wedding day. Judging by this one's hat, he had to be a tourist. At least the man had the manners to take his hat off inside, revealing a familiar face. Luce's heart stopped. Then he bolted. He didn't breathe again until he'd reached the office and put his back to the closed door. "If you were human, I'd say you look like you'd seen a ghost. Except you're you." Mephi wet her lips. "If you've just found out about what happened to Lilith in the latest failed coup, I heard from Beelzebub that she's fine. She woke up this morning with all her limbs again. As for the ringleaders, they're already in level 8. Luce shook his head. "I don't care about mutinies in hell. They'll never succeed. No, it's the angels. They found us." It was Mephi's turn to shake her head. "They can't have. We haven't done anything to draw attention to ourselves. I haven't drawn up a new soul contract in a month. There's no way they can know we're here." Lucifer dropped his lunch on her desk and pointed a shaking finger at the street outside. Then why was Raphael the hashmelon in ambrosia? It can't be him. He doesn't have anything to do with anyone less than a world leader. This is a state capital on the other side of the country from the national one. There's no one here who could possibly be worth his attention. She pressed her lips together. "You must be mistaken. You saw someone who merely looked like him." Luce badly wanted to believe her. So much. "Here or in heaven, I will never mistake the face and soul of the angel who led heaven's armies against me. He's here, and if it's not a human he's here for, then he's come for me. He probably has an army of Exushai, warrior angels just waiting to take me down." He raked his fingers through his hair. "It's my bad luck. Wherever I go, it follows me. I don't know how he found me, but he has, and our plan is doomed, just like all the rest. We've obeyed every human law. There's nothing he can do to stop us, even if it is him," Mephi insisted. Like she was trying to reassure a tantruming child. Someone she felt superior to. Luce stiffened. She was and never would be his superior. Mutinies might come from anywhere in hell, and he'd be damned before he let Mephi think she might succeed at one. "I hope you're right," Luce said. He let a dark smile lift his lips. "Because if you're wrong, you can join the mutineers in level 8. He swept through the office, snatching up his box of pastries. He'd considered offering her one when he bought them, but now he had no intention of sharing a single bite. He was the Lord of Hell, and no one was going to take anything away from him. Even Raphael, the snooty angel in a white suit. Lucifer had lost to him once, but he had no intention of doing so again. 10. A week went by, with no further sign of Raphael, or any other angel. Then another week. Luce began to believe Mephi might actually be right. Perhaps he'd only imagined some white-clad idiot who looked like Raphael, or the real Raphael hadn't noticed him at all. Either would work for him. Then the third week began and the bombshell exploded. Actually, it was more of a demon than a weapon, and it was a pretty quiet explosion, because Mephi didn't want to alert the neighbors. "That lying scumbag cheated you," she said. Luce left his office to clarify which scumbag and, more importantly, what he'd lost. "That treasurer Toller Dick. After all that work we did on the proposal, getting it checked over by his office and all, he's awarded the contract to some company called Jalco." Smoke trickled out of Mephi's ears. Rather fetchingly, Luce thought. "I'm going to call him and tell him what a wanker he is, and how hell has a special circle just for traitors like him." Luce considered stopping her, but he wasn't sure he wanted to admit he'd consulted Sammy Gina and not Dick, or that they'd spoken very little about the prison proposal. Very few words spoken at all. He returned to his office, where he could still clearly hear Mephi giving the politician a thorough rundown of what awaited him in hell. Then he heard her smash the receiver down on the phone and stomp to his office. "Do you know what that worm said?" she demanded. If she'd wanted him to hear, she would have put the call on speakerphone. Instead, she wanted to spit the words out like acid. What sort of devil would he be if he got between a demon and her righteous wrath? Mephi's face turned red. He said it wasn't his office, but the staff in the Department of Law who made the decision. He only had to sign off on the disbursement of funds. The contract gets signed by their head of department. As if a minister can't send a directive down to them, telling them who to hire. Something Dick Toller had assured him he'd do. There was more here than just some dodgy politician at work. Dick Toller didn't have the balls to cheat the devil unless he feared something or someone else more. "What's on the front cover of today's newspaper?" Luce asked. Mephi turned the paper over to check and sniffed loudly. Some minister in Canberra resigning because he used his expense account to take his mistress along on a foreign trip, while his wife stayed home with the kids. But not before he got the mistress a job in the ambassador's office. It says she. Luce didn't need the details, the headline said enough. Nepotism flying high before fall. What's the political cartoon? And the editorial? Mephi shrugged. Both about that minister, and how with increased public scrutiny and social media, any leader who thought nepotism, corruption, adultery, wasting public money and other such sins were acceptable, would be found out and punished well before the afterlife. Luce swore. "It's Raphael, I'm sure of it. Only an angel would be that obvious. He knows, and instead of confronting us directly, he's frightening humans away from working with us. Anything not to have to face me in battle again. He knows he'd lose a rematch, without all of heaven's armies behind him." "It can't be. Angels know nothing about our plans," Mephi insisted. Luce shrugged on his jacket. "I'll go over to the treasurer's office and get some answers from him myself." He strode out of the office, the darkness in his eyes promising punishment to anyone who dared cross him, until he was out of Mephi's sight. Dick Toller wasn't worth the effort of full-fledged fury. He was an insect in the overall scheme of things, a soul who already belonged to him, who could be tortured for eternity once his brief life was over. But Sammy Gina would have answers for him. Nothing went on in Toller's office without her knowledge, after all. 11. When a satisfied Sammy Gina languidly fastened her bra before beginning to button up her shirt, she said, "To what do I owe this visit? Or is it just that you can't get enough of me?" Her wicked smile said she knew the latter to be true. Luce didn't enlighten her. "I needed to get out of the office. My assistant is angry about some proposal not being accepted." Sammy Gina's eyes narrowed as she took the bait. "Oh, you mean the prison thing?" "Yes, Treasurer Toller has had our office very busy the last few weeks, changing procedures and improving transparency," he called it. "I think it all comes down to a letter he received about the same time as the prison's project applications closed. It came with a Freedom of Information request, you know, where any member of the public can request government records. This one asked for so much we had to pull in staff members from every department. Some anti-corruption vigilante or something, wanting all projects Treasurer Toller had approved funding for. All the files, with all the communication and everything." She reached for her in-tray and flipped open a folder. "Yes, this is the letter. Look." She turned it so Luce could see it, then went back to buttoning her shirt. Luce could feel his anger building, as he read a letter that sounded like a longer version of the editorial in the day's paper. And at the bottom sat a signature that belonged on a document from a past century, the U.S. Declaration of Independence perhaps. He'd smelled angelic intervention then too. But this one said the letter was from a Raphael D'Angelo, a lawyer if he was to be believed, who didn't even feel the need to hide his true identity. Once Mephi saw it, she'd believe him. "I need this," Luce said, reaching for the file. Sammy Gina slapped his hand lightly in warning. "The Treasurer's official correspondence file is a legal record which you can't have, no matter how much I like you. Maybe I could get you a copy of it, if you make it worth my while. I had intended to give you a copy of the prison project file, along with the assessment of the successful proposal, but if you're going to steal my documents, I might not allow you in my office at all, Mr. Iblis." Mephi might think souls were won with contracts, but Luce knew better. This was the moment he lived for, where a soul's fate hung in the balance, between damnation for corruption, the greed of personal gain. She thought she was tempting him, as she gave in to her darkest desires to hold power over what she thought was merely a powerful man. When in reality, she was surrendering all hope of her soul ever seeing heaven. It was an internal passionate storm the likes of which no hurricane could match. God, he loved it. Luce took a deep breath, pretending to consider her offer, while he reveled in the triumph of his victory. He took in her half-clothed body, letting his gaze linger on those lovely bare legs. Combining her soul's passion with the physical kind? No devil worth his salt would refuse. "Miss Hardy, I confess, the very thought of losing you leaves me in the very depths of torment. Name your desire, and I will do everything in my power to grant it." Off came the shirt and the bra, and she lay back, naked, across the papers on her desk. "You already know what I like, Mr. Iblis. Do your damnedest." Which of course he did. 12. While Mephi buried herself in the Jalco files, Luce did what he always did when he got bored. He found a brothel. "Hello ladies," he'd greeted the receptionists, for he'd made sure he was the first customer of the evening. "I'd like to engage your services for the night." One of the women coughed. "A first-time visitor? Just fill out these forms with your preferences, sir, and I'll speak to our staff about finding you the perfect companion to fulfill your needs." Luce beamed. Centuries might pass, but brothels never changed. "No, that won't do. I wish to engage all your services and all of your staff. In fact, I'd like to book your entire establishment for the night." Nothing fazed a brothel receptionist, least of all these two. "A private function? A bachelor party, perhaps? How many guests, sir?" "Just me." It took a little more convincing, but in a very short time he had the lounge and all the staff, from the canny madam right down to the staid receptionists, to himself. With an open bar, naturally. He was by no means the only man in the room, but that didn't bother him. No one understood the depths of human desire quite like someone paid to satisfy them, except the devil who damned people for them. It was the closest he'd ever been to coming home. Hell was hell, complete with demonic mutinies every other day and tortured screams echoing through the depths. Here the screams were mostly from pleasure, and the people provoking those screams knew their trade well. Bliss. Drinks flowed freely, and Luce laughed with the rest at the R-rated origami one of the girls created to illustrate some of her stories. He hoped he'd remember some of them well enough to tell the tales later. When the sun rose, Fabio and Fabienne, a pair who claimed to be twins before his Russian accent and her Yorkshire one destroyed the illusion, saw him out, calling after him to come back whenever he wanted. The second evening, he settled in the lounge, whiskey in hand, and started talking to the clients instead about some of the more exotic things the staff excelled at. Within the first hour, he'd tripled the place's profits and earned an invitation to the madam's boudoir. He'd lost count of the number of souls he'd marked for level 2 in hell, but then he never bothered counting them anyway. The more the merrier. It was past midnight when he ambled back to the office, well satisfied, but he found Mephi at her desk, looking as pleased with herself as if she'd been the one to bed the brothel madam. "What are you still doing here?" Luce asked, shrugging out of his jacket. "I've worked out how to get the prison's contract back," she said smugly. It took him a moment to remember what she was talking about. Once a plan failed, he moved on. From prison to brothel, as it were. "But Jalco have already signed." "I saw the contracts," he said, hanging his jacket up. Mephi licked her lips and gave a tight little smile. "Ah, but there's no way they can deliver at these prices. In fact, I'm not sure they ever meant to deliver. Even at minimum wage, they won't be able to pay their staff for the price the government will pay them to run the prison. Not once the place is built, anyway." Perhaps he shouldn't have had that third whiskey. Maybe if it had been in a glass, he'd have managed to refuse, but licking from living flesh. Luce shook his head, trying to clear it. "So we wait for them to breach their contract, and apply again? In what? A year or two, when construction is finished?" "We could," Mephi allowed. "Or we could simply buy Jalco now, and we'd own them and the contract. Our plan would be back on track, as if this hiccup never happened." A coffee would help. Thick and dark, it would clear the fog in his head. So they bid on the contract, with impossible terms they never intended to deliver, driving the sale price up while planning to offload the problem on their new buyer? He couldn't suppress a grin. "Oh, I like it." Distinctly dastardly. "Buy it." "What about the staff? We're not going to be able to get around the minimum wage problem. Not legally, anyway." Luce shrugged. "Lay them all off. Mass redundancies. This place is in the middle of a mining boom, isn't it? They'll have new jobs within the week. Then we bring in demons to replace them. Not like demons need paying. Just a little punishing every now and then, when they forget their place. Just like his place would be here now, with their plans coming to fruition. No more brothel visits for a bit." Luce sighed. Even the devil had to work sometimes. 13. Jalco turned out to have experience in not just running prisons but immigration centers and healthcare facilities, which quickly won Luce more government contracts than he knew what to do with. Hell had to be half empty, with how many demons they'd had to bring to the surface to staff them all. Then the entire health department was put up for privatization, followed by the Department for Environment. And Solcorp won them both. It was happening. Really happening. Luce was taking over the world, banishing his bad luck, and heading for heaven. This would work. If he only had a moment to catch his breath. "They've just listed the Department of Law," Mephi shouted. Don't we already have that? The prisons, yes, but not the courts. Or the state solicitor's office. Or the police. If we win this, we have them all. Luce didn't hesitate. Do it. We'll need more staff. I can't get demons fast enough to fill the positions we've got. Or at least ones who can pass for human. Some of them have been in hell for centuries, can't read, answer a phone or use a computer. Training them is too slow. Luce shrugged. Since when have government departments ever been efficient? I'm sure bureaucracy is synonymous with hell in most cases. Get bums in seats, slow or not. Mephi shuffled her papers, glancing at the one on top, then up at him as if she didn't dare say it, but knew she had to. Spit it out, Luce ordered. Well, there's this agency that provides temporary staff. Their people have experience in government projects. They worked in the departments before they got privatized, I believe. They left a flyer. She glanced down again. Luce grabbed the piece of paper. It wasn't a flyer so much as a white paper printout, all text with no pictures. Helpful Angels Agency, he read. No office job is too big or small. Government policy work, a speciality. Let our angels help you. Not real angels. They didn't get their hands dirty with real work. This had to be a bunch of humans, with their fanciful notions that angels could be anything but a colossal nuisance. Get some. It'll be fun to order a bunch of angels around, Luce said, dropping the flyer. 14. Running 3 government departments from the house he'd lived and worked in at the beginning was more than even the devil could manage, but he had to admit he missed the small office as he wandered through the office floors in Solcorp's new high-rise. They didn't fill the whole building yet, but it wouldn't be long now. Humans assembled desks and partitions while demons moved among them, shooting nervous glances in Luce's direction as they went about their business. The business of being public servants, or at least that's how it appeared. He'd left the staff allocations up to Mephi, Lilith and whoever Mephi deemed qualified to work in human resources. Though the only human resources they had were the temporary staff, and the demons outnumbered them more than 10 to 1. Mephi had insisted upon standard work weeks, office hours and even lunch breaks for the demon staff, so as not to appear any different to their human employees. You need to address the staff too, tell them where the company is headed. I've scheduled a session in the lunchroom next week. Luce stared at Mephi. I have to do what? The devil didn't tell his plans to anyone. She turned red. Well, not all your plans obviously, but things like our proposals to pick up children's services, welfare and the Department of Law. Maybe throw in a few jokes. You know, to make you seem like a normal human being. There was nothing normal about the Lord of Hell. Even when he'd been an angel, he'd been superior to everyone he knew. Telling them my plans and jokes is asking too much. Mephi didn't give up. You need to tell them at least one. Any other demon in hell he'd send straight back there to mop floors in the torture chambers, but he needed Mephi and her contract's knowledge here. Even with her official title as his personal assistant, she still ran the company. He gritted his teeth. One joke. One of the origami tales from the brothel, because if he didn't manage to get the origami right, he'd still get a laugh out of his audience, because demons were too afraid of him not to. In all the bustle of Solcorp's expansion, he could barely remember how the origami went. He hurried back to his office to practice. By the time he arrived at the lunchroom, armed with a large handkerchief that bore the marks of many origami folds, he figured he could at least tell the joke without embarrassing himself. The humans huddled together at a table in front, while demons filled the rest of the room, sitting or standing once the available seats ran out. Luce moved to the bar, a strange fixture in a government lunchroom, but it gave him an excuse to stand as well as a surface high enough for his origami when the time came. He delivered a quick speech about their current new acquisitions, and the likely ones in the future. "Any questions?" he asked. Before any hand dared rise, he added, "Because I have a joke for you if there aren't." All eyes turned to him. It occurred to Luce that he'd never told a joke to a bunch of demons before. Let alone this many. He cleared his throat. "It's about a magic carpet." Without waiting for a response, he continued, "A man walks into a Persian rug shop and asks the salesman for the best rug he has. The salesman grins and tells him that his best rug is in fact a magic carpet. All he has to do is sit on the carpet and say, 'Magic carpet, rise,' and the carpet will rise and fly him wherever he wants to go. They bargain for a while, but when both feel they have a good price, they agree and the man goes home with his Persian rug magic carpet." Luce spread his handkerchief out on the bar. So the man lays the carpet on the floor of his living room, sits down on it and says, "Magic carpet, please rise." Nothing happens. He tries sitting in different positions, standing on it, shouting at it, cajoling it, all to no avail. The rug just sits there, looking pretty on the floor. The next day, he's having a beer with friends, and one's an aeroplane engineer. They get to talking, and he asks the engineer for help with his magic carpet. The friend agrees and comes over to see what he can do for the carpet. The engineer takes one look at it and says, "No wonder it won't fly. It doesn't have any wings," and he gives it wings. Luce folded the corners. It didn't look much like wings, but he was certain this was how the origami went. After his friend left, the man sat on his carpet again saying, "Magic carpet, please rise." Still nothing. Annoyed, upset but not ready to give up yet, the next day he decides to go ask a mechanic for help. So he loads the carpet into the car, takes it to his mechanic and shows him the carpet. The mechanic looks at the carpet, the same way he looks at the man's car when it's going to cost a lot of money to fix, and finally says, "Of course it can't fly. It doesn't have an engine." So the mechanic puts an engine on the carpet. He folded the handkerchief again. He pays the mechanic and takes his carpet home again. He lays it out on the floor, hops on and says, "Magic carpet, please rise." The carpet just sits there, looking like an ordinary Persian rug, with wings and an engine. Angry, he loads the carpet into his car, determined to take it back to the shop to get his money back. On his way back to the rug shop, he drives past a brothel, and the girls are out on the street, looking for customers. He slows down, and one of the girls asks him if he needs some help getting his engine started. Feeling like it's the best thing that's happened to him all week, he agrees and he takes her back to his place. She notices the carpet and asks about it. He replies, "It's supposed to be a magic carpet, but it doesn't matter what I do. It just won't rise." The prostitute laughs and says, "Baby, trust me, I can make anything rise." So she gets her hands on the carpet and… Luce gritted his teeth, praying he'd remembered right. He breathed a sigh of relief as a handkerchief penis rose up from the bar. One of the human girls let out a scream, jumping out of her seat, as she pointed at the penis. "I knew it. Raphael was right, you are filth from the pit. The kind who can never win." Too late, Luce looked at her, really looked at her. How had he missed a real angel coming into the office? "That's not safe for work," she hissed. "You'll burn for this." "No, it's not real. Just a joke," he said shakily. But she was already running from the room, she probably hadn't heard. The humans at her table followed her, at a more sedate pace. Mephi waved her hand urgently at the demons in the room, who broke into loud laughter. Luce felt his fury build. Oh, they might be laughing at his joke, but it sounded more like they were laughing at him. Being fooled by a bloody angel, no less. "Make sure she doesn't come back," he hissed at Mephi, who hurried out, shutting the door behind her. Lucifer turned back to the assembled demons. Their laughter faded. "Who thinks that was funny?" he demanded. He was burning up inside. Outside too, his suit smoking as it touched his skin. No one mocked the Lord of Hell. No one. And anyone who even thought about it had earned a one-way ticket to hell. 15. You could have at least left me some of the cleaners, Mephi grumbled as she swept up body parts later that evening. Getting blood out of carpet isn't something I'm good at. It's all good and well ripping low-level demons apart in hell, but here it's so much messier. Good thing we won our bid on the Department of Law today, or we'd have to investigate ourselves. As it is, Ugh, I think you'll need new carpet in here. And I'll need to send a bus to Hell's Gate to pick them up for work once their bodies respawn, or they won't be back for weeks. I suggest not telling that joke again. I suggest not letting angels in here. How did she get in? Luce demanded. He wanted to wipe his hands on his suit, but it was already drenched in black demon blood. He'd probably end up with more of the stuff on his hands if he touched it. She was a temp from the Helpful Angels Agency. It was her first day, Mephi said. She shouldn't have been there, Luce grumbled, kicking someone's arm out of the way. Actually, I think it's good she was there. There's nothing she can do to stop us. Even if she tells Raphael and the Archangel himself comes here, there's nothing he can do. All our contracts with the West Australian government are signed and solid. Not even he can break them. It's time to make our presence known. Mephi lifted her chin as if daring him to rip her arms off for contradicting him. But Luce was done beating his frustrations out on demon bodies. You can't be serious. For months you've been telling me not to break any laws. I haven't had sex with anyone on my desk in weeks. Lilith doesn't count because sex with his mistress was more of a chore to keep her from inciting a new mutiny against him than a pleasure anymore, he thought but didn't say. Just because. I gave Ananiel permission to start her brothel in the food court because her staff wanted to practice on me. I've been so bloody chaste I might as well cut off my balls and pretend to be an angel. And now you're suggesting we get more of them in here? He slammed his hands down on the bar. No. Get this place cleaned up, get the staff back here, and call me if you absolutely need me. Until then, I'm going to see how many of the 7 deadly sins I can commit in a day without passing out. And then the next day, I'm going to see if I can beat my own record. Where he wasn't sure, but that didn't matter. Anywhere but here. Yes, Mr. Iblis, Mephi said with a sigh. 16. Luce tried to ignore the trilling phone, but it wouldn't shut up. He pried his face from between 2 rather lovely legs, taking a moment to realize that they belonged to 2 different people, judging by the hair on one and smooth skin on the other, and made his way out of bed to where he'd left his phone. Hell, oh, he said, emphasizing the hellish torture that awaited whoever had woken him from post-orgy slumber. Mr. Iblis, we have a problem. For our first project with the Department of Law, we've been asked to write some new legislation. And we don't have anyone anywhere near qualified for this. Where are you? We need you in the office to explain to the politicians. Where was he? Luce peered out the window. Some sort of giant coat hanger floated out there, all covered in lights. What city had floating coat hangers? I'm in Sydney. I think. Be there tomorrow. Book me on the next flight back. Luce gave one last longing look at the tangle of the limbs on the bed, before he resigned himself to packing up his things and making his way to the airport. 17. They're the only ones I can find qualified to write the new laws. I'm sorry, Mr. Iblis, Mephi said, smoothing out the resumes of not 1 but 2 candidates from the Helpful Angels Agency. If there were anyone else. After spending most of the morning arguing with Treasurer Toller that the state had no need for new animal cruelty laws, after all, he had a special level in hell for such scumbags, and nothing in the Solcorp-run prison system was anywhere near as bad as that, and actually losing to the spineless politician, Luce was in no mood for more frustration. Hire them. Tell them to make animal cruelty such a heinous crime, no one would dare hurt a hair on anything's head, for fear of the legal consequences. Tell them that by the time they're done, there won't be any boats left for refugees, because they'll be too full of rats trying to come here to enjoy such an animal paradise. Mephi's eyes widened. Really? Luce just wanted to go back to bed. Sadly, his bed here in Perth was empty. He wanted to go back to his Sydney penthouse, not the cold Perth one, but it couldn't be helped. Yes, really. Except maybe the rats part. We still want all the refugees, to keep the immigration centers open. We don't make money on rats. He left. Mephi hired both angels, she told him, confirming that they were definitely angels, giving Luce every reason to stay out of the office until their job was done. Then Mephi sent him a copy of their proposed bill. And Luce laughed so hard whiskey went up his nose. They'd written legislation tighter than a fish's anus, with so many tortuous twists and turns, it was impossible to do more than look at an animal without breaking it. Maybe even then, if the lengthy sections on the intent to commit crimes came in. Typical angels. They expected perfection, with no idea of how the world worked. With this one law, they'd be delivering souls to hell in droves. Set up a meeting for me with the angels to discuss their work tomorrow morning, Luce told Mephi. Then, after that, another meeting with Cabinet, so I can present their finished bill. Mephi did as he bade her, and the next morning, Luce strode into the office, more cheerful than he'd been in a long time. The angels were late to the meeting, and Luce headed to the elevator to hunt them down himself. But the door slid open as he approached, spilling out Lilith, followed by Camille, then Samael, the twin angels of death no less. Or former angels of death, judging by the feel of their souls now. Luce had to admit, Lilith wasn't too bad at seducing angels. She must have learned it from him. Or perhaps she was bad and that's what had won them over. He moved aside to allow Lily to walk stiffly out of the elevator, followed by her lovers. Only half of Samael's shirt buttons were fastened, and Camille's pants threatened to slip back down to his ankles if he didn't buckle his belt back up soon. Though the damp spot on the front of his trousers was telling. Lily had not only seduced the angels of death, but she'd managed to do both of them at the same time. Maybe she'd finally grow bored of him and not bother him anymore. At least Luce hoped so. Just who I was looking for, Luce said, lifting his lips in a professional smile at the two men. Lily stopped, consternation radiating off her. Me? No, our resident legal experts. I don't want to let you boys go. How do you feel about a permanent position with Solcorp? Heading up our new legal department. Camille and Samael exchanged glances. Their corrupted souls wouldn't be welcome back at the helpful angels agency, and Luce knew his offer was more than tempting. Time to sweeten it a little. You'll be working alongside Lily, and I can offer you the services of some of Anna's very capable administrative assistants. Perhaps two each, to make sure they can cope with the workload? Luce winked, knowing the girls wouldn't be doing much administration. Freshly fallen angels were randy as hell when they first discovered sex. It's a promotion from being Lily's bum boys, I'm sure. To his delight, both angels blushed. Well, Lily had done them both at the same time, and they'd switch sides. Lily's expression reddened in barely contained fury. What am I supposed to do without my assistants? Luce shrugged. Hire a new one and don't seduce them. Maybe he was getting the hang of this no sexual harassment thing. 18. I don't like it. It's a sop to the bleeding hearts and we'll lose too many votes. It's the sort of left-wing craziness that only leads to legalizing bestiality, Toller said. Don't be ridiculous. If anything, this new animal cruelty legislation makes the penalty for molesting animals the highest anywhere in the world. The moment it passes into law, I want to call for an election." Fallon Fitzroy, the Premier and head of the West Australian state government, said. "Mr. Iblis, you are truly a miracle worker." Luce managed a modest laugh. What the Premier didn't know, didn't matter. "But the cost, introducing new laws always costs so much," Toller whined. "We're already struggling with a budget deficit, which Mr. Iblis is helping us pay off more quickly than any other government in recorded history," Fitzroy finished for him. "Mr. Iblis, how much more is implementation going to cost the state budget?" "As I mentioned in my briefing, nothing at all, Mr. Premier," Luce lied smoothly. "Actually, he'd probably hire some of Raphael's angels to deal with it, add a hefty markup, and charge the government for it as a consulting fee or something. Mephi would know how to do it." Fitzroy spread his hands wide. "There you go, Dick. Nothing to worry about, at all. We're in good hands with Mr. Iblis running the show. Maybe you should resign before the next election, and let Mr. Iblis here stand as the party candidate in your place." Toller's eyes widened in terror before he forced out a laugh. "Oh, I could never let the party down like that, Mr. Premier. We need Mr. Iblis right where he is, I'm sure." Fitzroy's answering smile seemed more like a grimace to Luce, but it seemed a touch more sincere when he directed it at Luce. "Well, thank you for your time, Mr. Iblis. We have a couple of other matters to discuss, which shouldn't take long. If you're willing to wait outside for, maybe 10 minutes or so, I'd love to hear your thoughts on a private matter. One of my staff will get you coffee while you wait." Luce nodded and left. Right outside the room, he came face to face with Sammy Gina. She flashed him a professional smile. "Mr. Iblis, what a pleasure. Premier Fitzroy asked me to make you comfortable until the meeting is over. What would you like?" No one watching would have guessed from her manner that they'd ever had sex, let alone in pretty much every position possible. "Seeing as he said he won't be long, I suppose a quicky's out of the question," Luce said, wondering if he'd get a rise out of her. A faint blush touched her cheeks, but nothing else. Whatever feelings Sammy Gina might have had for him, she'd forgotten them. If she'd ever felt anything at all. "I'll get you a coffee then, shall I?" "Let someone from the Premier's office get it," Luce said. She shrugged. "I work here now. The Premier's Chief of Staff plans to retire after the election, and they were short a research officer in the interim. And an ambitious Chief of Staff who could see the imminent fall from grace of her present boss, leaped at the opportunity to make herself invaluable to the Premier, and perhaps even snag herself a better position after the election. He'd admired her ambition in the past, but then it had been fueled by passion. Now it just seemed cold." Luce gave himself a little shake. They'd had fun in the past, but he doubted he'd enjoy sex with her now. She was colder than Lilith, and that was saying something. He felt a touch of sadness for the loss of such fiery passion, but he smothered it before it could show on his face. It didn't do for the devil to be sentimental, not even around humans, who thought he was one of them. Sammy Gina brought his coffee. Yes, she did know how he liked it, and moved to leave. "Can you tell me one thing, Miss Hardy?" Luce asked, unable to stop himself. A knowing smile crossed her face. "What, Mr. Iblis? What kind of parents call their daughter Sammy Gina?" Her eyes widened with shock. So she had been expecting a feelings question. Whether she'd loved him or some such human notion. As if the devil were capable of, or even cared about love. She recovered quickly, lifting her shoulder in a shrug. Parents who wanted a boy, who they wanted to call Samuel or George. When they had a girl, they fought over Samantha and Georgina instead. My father's assistant handled all his paperwork, so she filled out the forms. Sammy Gina, no middle name. My mother divorced him when she saw my birth certificate. Oh! He'd hoped for some story about a previous career in exotic dancing. Though being a politician's chief of staff probably required a similar amount of flexibility. Mr. Iblis, thank you for waiting. Fitzroy enthused, holding out his hand for Luce to shake. Call me Luce please, Mr. Premier, Luce said. He'd mastered the firm, purportedly honest handshake long ago. Then you must call me Fallon. I insist. I had hoped to have time to meet with you, but something's come up, and it can't wait. Can you tee up a time with my staff so we can have drinks sometime? Whenever suits you, the Premier said, already heading away. Sammy Gina inclined her head. I'll take care of it. Luce watched Toller slink out of the meeting room, heading for the elevator without looking at anyone. 19. Oh, look who's coming in early. He's one of yours, isn't he? Mephi laid the newspaper on Luce's desk. Luce peeled his eyes away from the painting on the wall. He'd moved them from his old office to this one and found that the more he looked, the more details he saw. Remarkable, really. I don't have a meeting with Treasurer Toller today, Luce said. Of course not. You'd be late already if you did, and even he can't expect to be greeted at Hell's Gates. Far worse sinners than him about. Luce blinked. He's dead? He reached for the newspaper. Below the half-page picture of the late treasurer, a few lines detailed that he died in a car accident while driving home from a party fundraiser. There were suggestions about the man's sobriety or lack of it, before a final line about an unknown woman who also died in the accident. Any idea who the woman was? Well, it definitely wasn't his wife. Mephi grinned. Can't keep to just one deadly sin, can they, the damned? Always have to try for a full set. Her phone rang and she answered it. A moment later, she hung up. Citri from Health attended the fundraiser last night, and it seems she's not in this morning. Lily said she's not answering her phone either. Lily's mad because she had a bet with Citri over who could get into a politician's pants last night, and Lily went home alone. So a demon had had a hand in the man's death. Luce wasn't sure what to feel about it. On the one hand, the man had been a sinner through and through, causing more trouble the longer he lived. Taking him away from the living was doing humanity a favor. On the other, a man had died due to unnatural causes, and demons weren't allowed to kill humans. Tempt them, yes. Offer them their deepest desires and grant them in exchange for their soul, yes. But they weren't allowed to shorten a human's lifespan to claim a soul early. If angels found out, there would be trouble. Make sure Citri knows not to come back here. Destroy any records that she ever worked here. We're not to be associated with this death in any way. Luce opened his email inbox. When's my meeting with the Premier? Oh, his office called this morning wanting to reschedule. Instead of this afternoon, they suggested. Luce cut her off. Call the Premier's office. I'm heading over there now. 20. Luce arrived in time to see the end of the Premier's press conference. The Premier stood on the steps outside his office, haloed in the morning sun as he talked about the tragedy, and how he would honor his colleague's memory by presenting the Treasurer's bill in Parliament today. He'd forced Toller to present the animal cruelty bill today? No wonder the man had been drinking last night. Or willing to take Citri home. Luce had suspected a shark sat behind Fallon Fitzroy's easy smile, but now he knew for certain. But sharks were soulless and Fitzroy still possessed his soul. Something Luce would happily relieve him of if the opportunity presented itself, because the devil would neither forget nor forgive the man if he brought angels down on Soulcorp. Especially now when they were doing so well. As the assembled media began to drift away, Fitzroy caught Luce's eye and beckoned for him to follow him into the building. If you could wait here for just one moment while I make a call, I'll be right with you, Fitzroy promised as he shut the door to his office in Luce's face. "What are you doing here? Is this your foul work?" Luce turned to find Raphael standing in front of the couch in Fitzroy's waiting room. The angel looked like he was about to commit the sin of wrath. "I don't know what you're talking about," Luce lied smoothly. It was so easy to hate an angel like Raphael. Solcorp. Killing politicians and making it look like an accident. "I know what you're doing. This has the stench of brimstone all over it." Luce shrugged, pausing to sniff his lapel. "No, just guilty." "I knew you were guilty." Luce sighed. "No, I'm not guilty. Just my aftershave. It's the patchouli in it. If I weren't already God's gift to, well, everyone really, and already irresistible, I'd say it adds to my allure. It even works on you. I can feel your temperature rising from here. Whereas brimstone has more of a just farted quality to it." To Luce's delight, Raphael's face grew rather red. Almost demonic. "I will stop at nothing to bring this corrupt government down, and you with them. Just because this place is isolated, doesn't mean the rest of the world isn't watching. The mining resources in this state alone make it very important in global circles, and if you think..." A polite cough made them both turn. Fitzroy wore his iciest smile. "Mr. Iblis, so sorry to have kept you waiting. Especially after the most generous contribution you made at last night's fundraiser. With you on our side, we can't possibly lose this election. Will you please come into my office?" Raphael turned on the Premier. "Mr. Premier, you have a meeting with me, not him. I'm the one you've kept waiting for more than an hour while you lied to the press outside." Fitzroy blinked. "I believe you're mistaken, Mr. D'Angelo. My assistant has no record of any meeting with you, today or any other day, and I suggest you remove yourself from the premises before I call security." Raphael glowered. "I'm watching you," he said, shaking a finger, though Luce wasn't sure whether it was at himself or the Premier. The Premier gestured for Luce to precede him into the office, which he did. When the door shut behind Fitzroy, the Premier breathed a hefty sigh of relief. "Mr. Iblis, I swear you are heaven-sent. If you hadn't appeared, I might have had to listen to that anti-corruption crusader for the next hour. What with him sniffing around Toller's unfortunate death and the new leader of the opposition, between you and me, I'm not sure of this election at all." In a tableau that had played out countless times over the millennia Lucifer had walked the earth, he spread his arms wide in invitation. "What do you desire from me, Mr. Premier?" 21. He's a do-gooder, a wildlife warrior. An ex-park ranger. He's a migrant from South Africa, and he's actually done some volunteer work in the big game parks over there. He's young, never been married, no kids, he's so virtuous it makes my teeth hurt. "What's he look like?" Luce asked. Fitzroy took a moment to tap at his keyboard, before pointing at his computer screen. "That's their patron saint, Hunter Lowe." The tall blonde bloke in the photo could have been a poster child for the Nazi campaign. He looked like such a perfect specimen. Perhaps it was good for him he'd been born into a different world, 50 years too late. "Have you tried running an image search?" He looks young enough to have spent most of his adult life online. Surely he did something as a teenager, or at college. Luce copied the photo, then pasted it into an image search for Lowe's face. Fitzroy shook his head. "You won't find anything. He came over here as a teenager, got top grades in high school, and then on at university. Double degree in environmental and political science. A few years younger and he might have gone to school with my kids." Luce scanned the images that came up. Plenty of wildlife, including one that looked familiar. He clicked on it, and an article came up. "Jackpot," Luce hissed, reading the headline. "Trophy hunter kills lion." Below it was a photo of Hunter Lowe, kneeling behind the lion's corpse. "If this picture gets out, it'll be the perfect backdrop for your party platform with the new animal cruelty laws. Fluffy cuteness everywhere for you and your candidates, while the leader of the opposition is branded a brutal killer. Public opinion worldwide will win the election for you," Luce said. Fitzroy shook his head. "It won't work. The article says a trophy hunter killed the lion, but it doesn't name Lowe. Even though it's clearly him. It'll be enough. Email the link to me. My office will see the article gets out, everywhere, the day you declare the election." Fitzroy enveloped Luce's hand in both of his. "Thank you, Mr. Iblis. I owe you more than I can say. On election night, I want you to be my personal guest in the party rooms. If we're victorious like you say, my first action in my next term as Premier will be to buy you a drink." "Make it a top-shelf scotch," Luce said. The last time he'd gone up against Raphael, he'd lost everything. But this time, he'd do anything to win. The angel didn't stand a chance. 22. By the time Election Day rolled around, Luce was willing to bet there wasn't a voter in the world, let alone Western Australia, who hadn't seen the picture of Hunter Lowe with a dead lion, or subsequent shots with a slaughtered rhinoceros missing its horn. By the time Lowe's PR team had managed to get hold of him and determine the real details behind the photos, it was much too late. Lowe's time as a volunteer ranger, who had helped the other rangers investigate poachers, was considered to be a hastily constructed lie. Only Luce and Fitzroy knew it to be true. Luce held his tongue on the matter, but Fitzroy had given an impassioned speech about how his government had a long history of protecting the wildlife of Western Australia, on the centenary of some island being declared a nature reserve. He talked about how hunting had killed off species on the mainland, and why islands were so important to protect the wildlife that was left. Every word he said emphasized how things had happened in the past, but had to be forgotten if they were to protect the future. Even Lowe, he said, would surely recognize his own past mistakes, and should want to make it up to the generations of the future, by ensuring good governance. The man was a masterful hypocrite, but he was a persuasive one, and Luce found himself almost admiring Fallon Fitzroy. Oh, Fitzroy belonged in hell for certain, but to suggest his rival, a good man by all accounts, though hardly a perfect one, given he'd chosen to enter politics, should be forgiven for sins he hadn't committed and allowed, even encouraged, to vote for Fitzroy and his friends. Why, it suggested some sort of divine comedy at work. As long as Raphael and not Lucifer was the clown. No one would dare poke fun at the devil. They'd know a special circle of hell would await them. Waiters ran around, handing out glasses and topping up drinks in a feverish rush, as if something had already happened. Luce glanced at his watch. It was barely 6 in the evening. No election result had ever been called this early. The polls couldn't have even. It's officially 6 and the polls have closed. The counting has commenced, Fitzroy said, a grin on his face that for once was reflected in his feverish eyes. He raised his glass. To the right party staying in power. Laughter bubbled up before everyone in the room echoed his toast. And why wouldn't they? These were Fitzroy's supporters, the people who'd funded and helped him and his party during the election campaign. They genuinely wanted him to succeed. Oh, they had their own reasons for it, founded in greed or personal gain or some other, hardly benevolent motive, but they wanted him to rise. Luce, on the other hand, merely waited for Fitzroy's inevitable fall. No matter how high he rose, the man's fall was inevitable. And hell would be waiting. But that didn't mean Luce wasn't willing to use Fitzroy's ambition to settle an old score. Tonight, Luce wasn't being altruistic either. At least they'd have their answer tonight: who would govern Western Australia in the morning? Compulsory voting did have that advantage. The wait began. We have our first confirmed seat. The shout was followed by cheers and another round of celebratory drinks. As each electorate fell at Fitzroy's feet, the crowd grew more and more rowdy. The alcohol flowed freely and most of them were royally drunk already. The exception was Fitzroy himself, of course, who would be expected to give a speech, when enough seats had been awarded, to give one party a majority in Western Australia's Legislative Assembly, Parliament's lower house, and to proclaim Fitzroy or Lowe as both the leader of the majority party and the next premier. 25 seats, someone crowed. 30 was the magic number, and it was fast approaching. 27. 28. 29. One more and Raphael would lose. Come on, number 30, Luce prayed. Speak of the angel. The screen full of electorates and their percentages, cut to what looked like some sort of public meeting hall, earlier in the day. In front of a crowd stood Raphael, delivering a blistering speech. Fitzroy and his party have promised the world, the moon and stars to the state of Western Australia in their election campaign. They've dragged the name of a good man through the mud, while their own is soiled so deep in corruption allegations not even sandblasting would make them clean. If this man, this hypocrite, is allowed to represent you, the people of Western Australia, then you must hold him accountable. For I truly believe he cannot deliver on his promises. He will try to make you pay for his lies. But I tell you, don't give in. Make him give you what he promised. You deserve better. To Fitzroy and all those who support him, I tell you, your time is coming. We will not tolerate corruption and hypocrisy. When I find the devil who is behind all this, I will hold you and him accountable. Luce laughed aloud at the empty threat. He was already banished from heaven and sentenced to an eternity in hell. There was nothing more that Raphael could do to him. But now for the first time Raphael felt powerless. And there was fear in his eyes. Fear that Lucifer truly would win. As he would. 30, someone screamed. As he had. Fitzroy stepped up to the podium, waving his supporters to one side so the media could record his victory speech. He looked a little worse for wear, like he had drunk one too many beers over the course of the night. Yet his words didn't sound slurred at all. Thank you, Western Australia, Fitzroy shouted, to frenzied cheers at the end of his speech. Yes, thanks indeed, Luce thought as he signaled the waiter for another drink. He too needed to drink to his victory. 23. Luce stayed in the background, while Fitzroy accepted handshakes and congratulations from everyone else. Someone thrust a drink into his hand, and Fallon downed it in 3 gulps. Luce bided his time, he had eternity after all. He amused himself by counting the virtuous souls in the room. 4 no 5 wait. 6 no 5 again. Number 6 was a weary-looking waitress, who kept disappearing into the cool room for more drinks. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, when most of the revelers headed home in taxis or cars driven by sober spouses, Luce sought Fitzroy. He found him in the courtyard garden, barfing his guts out on a bed of begonias. Too much celebrating, Fallon? Luce asked, offering the man a stack of napkins he'd grabbed from the bar. Perhaps, Fitzroy said weakly, wiping his mouth. He looked around. When he seemed satisfied that no one was in earshot, he added, Have you ever done something that you regretted later? Haven't we all? Luce said with a shrug. Yes, but what if D'Angelo was right? Without Toller around to run the numbers, we might have overextended ourselves. Promised more than we can deliver. What will happen when the public find out? Then Lowe would get his chance in the limelight, or the leader who replaced him. What did it matter? Evidently it mattered to Fitzroy. Enough to make him lose his lunch. Could the man be feeling that mythical emotion, remorse? Impossible. Luce clapped him on the back. That's why you have me, Fallon. When your government finds itself short of money, sell some of your assets. Privatize a department or two. I promise you, I'll be waiting to help you out. You can build your quays and hospitals, highways and sporting stadiums, and I'll be there in the background running the government for you. The voters will never know. Fitzroy's eyes grew wide and hollow. But what happens when we have nothing left to sell? Luce laughed. There's always your soul, Fallon. I'm sure I could find someone willing to buy that. The question is, what would you trade it for? Fitzroy's courage seemed to fade at that point, and he decided to lay down in the begonias to sleep off his hangover. Luce had no such problems. He walked out to the taxi rank, whistling, wondering how long it would take before Fitzroy remembered that conversation and sought him out. It was only a matter of time. 24. Luce bounced into the office on Monday morning, smiling so hard demons bolted out of his path in terror. "Miffy, I want you to call the Helpful Angels Agency. See about getting Lily a new assistant. Someone friendly to help with inquiries when the new animal cruelty laws kick in. Let Raphael send in an angel. Let him send in a dozen angels." Luce's bad luck was officially over. He was on the rise, and it was Raphael and Michael's turn to fall. He grinned fiercely. Miffy didn't scare easily. She merely lifted one eyebrow. "Sure. Anything else, Mr. Iblis?" "I want to change the name of SoulCorp. It's time to tell the angels who we are. Register us as the Hell Corporation, though make up some acronym to keep humans from guessing the truth. Health, Environment, Law and Lands? No, not quite right. Maybe life instead of law? I don't care. As long as the hell is all in capitals." "Yes, Mr. Iblis." "Oh, and I want you to send Raphael a gift, care of the Helpful Angels Agency. A bottle of guilty aftershave. The same one I use. Any message, Mr. Iblis?" Luce thought for a moment. No, the bottle should be enough. Let Raphael figure out what it means. He entered his office, then turned around to look out the window. "Isn't it a beautiful day, Miffy?" "If you say so, Mr. Iblis." "Oh, I do." And yet, it was empty. Victory shouldn't feel so hollow. Well, he'd find something to fill soon enough. In the meantime, he'd amuse himself with whatever new angels Raphael sent him. 25. So the interview's today? What's the angel's name, anyone I recognize? Luce asked Lily. Lily threw the folder of papers down on the desk. Read it yourself. I don't know one angel from another. Luce lifted the first page and scrutinized the well-spaced type. Melody Angel? That's not a real name. Unless she's brand new and she chose it herself. Lily shrugged jerkily. Who cares what her background is? She's here as Raphael's spy, so of course she wouldn't use her real name. Angels can't lie, so I'll catch her out in the interview and we can get rid of her without offering her a job. That's my decision, not yours. She might be someone I recognize. Luce wondered who she could be. Maybe Gabrielle, the archangel he'd managed to get royally drunk in Russia about a century ago, who'd spent the whole revolution unconscious or stumbling around with the mother of all hangovers. By the time she'd been able to do much to quell the riot, the army had arrived and it was much too late. He'd collected a bumper harvest of souls during that particular conflict, regiments full of traitors. Lily grumbled but finally gave him the details of the interview. Luce decided he'd show up at the end, just as the angel was leaving the interview room, and see if he could surprise her into giving away her true identity somehow. Maybe he'd do what he did to the last girl and spill his coffee all over her pristine whites. Not like he'd be drinking the stuff. The instant office brew put sewage to shame. He tried to focus on work, but couldn't suppress his excitement when he received an email from Lily with nothing but 2 words in the subject line. "She's here." Luce strode to the kitchen and spooned instant coffee into a mug, filling it with just enough hot water to dissolve the granules before topping it up with cold water and milk. He wanted to shock the angel, not burn her, and an impromptu cold shower wouldn't hurt. He wove between partitions, surveying the desks occupied by industrious demons. None of them dared look up to meet his eyes, which was a good thing, given what he was doing. Lurking outside the interview room for a glimpse of his next target. He had a good feeling about this one, and he hoped like hell he was right. After what felt like forever, Lily cracked open the door. She eyed the coffee in his hand and smirked. She'd enjoyed the previous angel's distress at her soiled whites too. Lily gave him a terse nod and opened the door wider, waving for the girl to leave first. Luce strode forward, drawing his arm back to better fling the coffee over the girl, but in his eagerness he'd misjudged his timing. Her unhurried steps made her almost collide with him, but she pulled up short before she touched him. Luce panicked. His coffee was already starting to splash out of his cup, so he jerked forward to catch it before it gave away that the spill was deliberate. He didn't manage to catch all of it though. A splatter landed on his shoe. Yet none had touched his angelic target. "Damn," he blurted out, dabbing the mess from his shoe before returning his handkerchief to his pocket. He stayed in his crouch for a moment longer than he needed, noticing for the first time that the angel's shoes were golden brown, not white. The same color as the coffee he'd tried to spill on her. What kind of angel didn't wear white? Did that mean she was already soiled? He inhaled sharply, taking in her skirt suit. This was golden brown too, from the knee-length hem to the curve of her breasts, modestly covered but clearly outlined by the well-tailored jacket. Lily must have made a mistake. This girl couldn't be an angel. Maybe she was human. He drew in a deep breath and it was filled with her scent, a delectable mix that almost dropped him back to his knees. Heaven. The girl smelled of heaven, a fragrance he hadn't experienced in millennia. Not since he'd been thrown into hell in the first place. Did she know her perfume would unman him? He'd be damned before he let some spying angel see his weakness. Instead, he was going to expose hers. All of her weaknesses. And those breasts too. Her raised eyebrows made him wonder if she could read his mind. No, surely not. Luce summoned a smile. "I don't believe I've seen you in the office before, and I make it a point to know all of my staff intimately." For a second, he could have sworn she penetrated his soul with those enigmatic gray eyes. If she could, then she knew who and what he was. No. He was the one in control here, not her. And he knew how to get her to reveal what she knew of him. Luce shoved his coffee cup at Lily and stuck out his hand, introducing himself. Every angel he touched, he corrupted. Any angel who'd heard his name knew that. When she refused to shake his hand, he could throw her out of the building and she'd never bother him again. Warm fingers curved over the top of his, transporting him back to memories from more than 2 centuries ago in the ballrooms of Europe. She rested her hand on his, like a shy debutante accepting his offer to dance a stately minuet. Was that when she'd lived? She could be a freshly risen angel, given her first assignment up from escort duty. He leaned in closer to catch her soft voice. "I'm Mel," was all he heard before Lily's voice drowned her out, telling him details he already knew. Damn it, it was the girl he wanted to hear. But the girl lowered her eyes demurely to the floor, as if embarrassed by his scrutiny. He glared at Lily for interrupting her, and saw Lily's warning head shake. She didn't want this girl working for her. But Luce did. She could be exactly what he needed. He longed to bear this spy's secrets, along with the breasts her jacket wasn't hiding. "Is that so?" he prompted but received no reply. He had to employ the girl, if only for a chance to find out more. I suspect I'll be seeing a lot more of you very soon then." She withdrew her fingers from his grasp and shot him a glance that surprised him. That looked like a firm no, he decided, thrilled at the challenge. First daring to touch him and now disbelief, she had no idea who she was dealing with. "I look forward to welcoming you to the Hell Corporation," he finished with a pointed glance at Lily. Simmering, the demon gave him a tiny nod in response. She'd employ the girl, but Lily would make her life a living hell. Luce knew the look well. He regarded the girl, wondering if she'd be able to withstand whatever Lily threw at her for long enough to let him conquer her soul. Mel raised her eyes to meet his and smiled. Not one of his tight, forced smiles, but the sort of sweet expression that lifted her lips, warmed her eyes and revealed distracting dimples. Perfect. She was perfect. Lucifer lifted his hand to his nose, breathing in the faint, lingering scent of heaven from her touch. "Hello, Melody Angel," he thought as he watched her walk out to reception with Lily. "Welcome to hell. Once you're in, you'll never leave," he'd make certain of it. Heaven can't help her now, for her and all her secrets would be his. 26. No, that wasn't how it had happened at all. The Lord of Hell, stooping to play tricks on some low-level angel? Please? If he gave an angel that inexperienced his full attention, he'd be in possession of her soul already. Instead, the first time he met Melody Angel had gone more like this. "Mephi, get me a coffee," Luce shouted. When 10 minutes passed without the appearance of Mephi or a cup of coffee, he shouted again. "Mephi." No response. Swearing, Luce left his desk in search of his disobedient assistant. She wasn't at her desk or in the kitchen, and they appeared to be out of coffee too. His computer chimed with an incoming email. Just 2 words from Lily. "She's here." Well, that wasn't helpful. An angel would have had the patience to wait. The Lord of Hell stomped down to the lunchroom and made himself a cup of coffee with the plentiful supplies of the stuff he provided for the ordinary employees. Then he took a sip and grimaced. Bitter and burned, yet barely lukewarm. He'd had better coffee in hell. Hotter too, though he could fix that. He stuck his finger in the cup, sending up a wisp of steam. Luce grinned. Being the devil had its perks. Striding toward Lily's cubicle where he expected to find his mistress and his assistant, Luce debated what sort of punishment the 2 demons deserved for forcing him to make his own coffee. He heard a door open on his left, but he paid it no attention. Anyone who got in his way when he was on the warpath deserved to have their limbs ripped off. And any demon who'd crossed his path before would know that, and keep well away. Oh! The feminine gasp was far from familiar and so close to his ear, Luce could imagine her curves wrapped around him, naked, wanting. He met her eyes with a knowing look, but all he saw was a blinding flash. Luce blinked. Somehow, he'd landed on the floor, crouched on one knee with his forehead bare millimeters from a cheap brown vinyl shoe. So cheap the Kmart clearance sticker still clung to it. Luce suppressed a snort. A desperate human's shoe, no doubt, because no demon would be caught dead in Kmart shoes, while angels almost exclusively wore white. He glanced at his own designer shoes, black as the void of course, and grimaced as he spotted the splash of coffee marring the usually shiny surface. He whipped out a handkerchief, also black, to deal with the damage. A few swipes fixed it so quickly no one, not even Miss Kmart clearance, could have noticed. Even if she had, Luce concentrated, radiating menace that sent demons from nearby cubicles scurrying away. He was surprised to find the brown shoes hadn't budged. Stupid human. Probably too dense to even realize the danger she was in, standing in the devil's way. He sighed. Or he tried to. The deep breath he took, intending to blow it out, lingered in his nostrils, taunting him, tempting him like nothing else. Gardenia, citrus dancing across the top of the spicy scent of myrrh. Heaven. She smelled like a slice of heaven. Damn! The word slipped out of his lips before he inhaled deeply again, just to make sure. She was an angel then. Not human. But still stupid, so fresh from heaven that the scent clung to her clothes. Clothes that weren't quite as cheap as her shoes, for they clung to her curves in most of the right places. Her suit wasn't new, like the shoes, it was shiny from wear, turning the golden brown almost gold in places. Like she was a newly minted angel who'd returned to Earth and her old clothes from her human life. For no angel wore gold or brown or highlighted her figure. Angels didn't dare think of sex or they'd fall. An angel who wore something like this was a temptation. A risk to other angels and herself. Because to tempt the devil, she was either stupid or brave or both. He dragged his gaze away from her perfect breasts, which filled out the jacket so well he knew they were the same size as they'd been when she was human, not a reflection of her angelic perfection, and stared at her face instead. An angel's eyes should have been downcast, in modesty or apology or whatever virtue she'd been elevated to heaven for. Instead, the only thing he found elevated were her eyebrows, asking a question he did not know the answer to. He wanted her. Needed to touch her. Possess her. But he still held his coffee cup in his hand. He thrust the offending thing at the nearest demon. He narrowed his eyes. The angel's breasts were the only perfect thing about her. Her face, body, all of it, was as ordinary as her shoes. He'd seduced a dozen women far more beautiful than her in the last week. Likely more. So what was it about this angel that had his attention? I don't believe I've seen you in the office before, and I make it a point to know all of my staff intimately. He held out his hand to shake the angel's. Luce Iblis, CEO of the Hell Corporation. She reached out to touch him, and he felt a triumphant grin lift his lips. The moment her palm met his, he'd have free access to her soul, a soul that would belong to him in a few moments. Then he'd know her every desire, her every secret, her. Her fingers curved over his, accepting his unspoken invitation to dance. I'm Mel, she said, her lips parting as though she wanted to say more, but she was lost for words. Oh, that was good. Very good. A few more minutes, and she'd lose more than her vocabulary, as she willingly surrendered to him. He drank in her unfocused gaze, reeling in the soul below. Lilith's strident voice broke the spell. This is her first time here. She's being interviewed for a position here at Health, Environment, Life and Lands Corporation, as my executive officer, Lilith snapped. Mine, Lilith's flashing red eyes seethed. She intended to crush this angel. Like hell she would. This one was his. Is that so? I suspect I'll be seeing a lot more of you very soon then. I look forward to welcoming you to the Hell Corporation. Triumph welled up in his chest as the angel, Mel, lowered her gaze in submission. So did Lilith, though he knew Lilith's compliance was a lie. He wasn't sure what aroused him more, the prospect of the angel's complete surrender or punishing Lilith. Not that it mattered. The devil would sate all his desires. Restraint wasn't part of his nature. And he'd enjoy both. 27. Hours later, when Lilith lay naked on his desk, panting too hard from her pleasurable punishment to say another word, Luce zipped up his pants. He should have felt sated, but he wanted more. Something sweet, that began with hearing Mel's soft gasp again, increasing in volume until she screamed his name. Lilith slithered off the desk, sliding her dress on slowly as if engaging in a striptease in reverse. Always seduction from her. It rarely worked on him anymore, but Luce would have pounded his frustration into a blow-up doll if he'd thought the sex toy could take it. Demons like Lilith were much more durable. Call Raphael. Tell him I want to see his melody angel here in hell first thing Monday morning, Luce ordered over his shoulder as he headed for his private bathroom to wash his hands. This wasn't the first time he'd felt dirty after coupling with Lilith. He was willing to wager he wouldn't want to wash his hands at all after betting the angel. "I don't want her. She's overqualified, overconfident, and ordinary." "Obviously a spy," Lilith said, still wriggling into her dress as she appeared in the bathroom doorway. "Obviously," Luce agreed, drying his hands on a towel. "She's a low-level angel, no loss to Raphael if we'd turned her today. Not the slightest bit tempting in her cheap shoes and old clothes." That was a lie, but the Lord of Lies couldn't truly deserve the title if he didn't lie to himself once in a while. Even he wasn't sure what had really happened in the moments he'd met Melody Angel. Her smell, the spilled coffee, her breasts, all those he remembered with perfect clarity, but the other details were hazy. Had he deliberately dropped to his knees, or had he fallen? Had he spilled coffee on her, hidden by her drab brown outfit, or had her angelic purity somehow repelled it? He'd gone over the meeting in his head so many times the details were a blur, until he wasn't sure which parts were true and which parts he'd made up. All but the fact that she'd left without surrendering her soul. How had that happened? He found Lilith staring at him. If she suspected he was losing his touch, she'd lead the next mutiny for sure. "What?" he snapped. "Why do you want to hire her so much?" Lilith asked, her eyes knowing. Never mind that she'd been his mistress for millennia. The stupid human-turned-demon didn't know anything. "Because Raphael doesn't want us to. And I'll be damned before I do what an angel wants." Lilith flashed an evil grin. "So you're going to turn that plain little angel out of revenge for Raphael?" No. This wasn't about revenge or Raphael. It was about the angel. He wanted her, and what the devil wanted he seized. Because that's what the devil did. Of course, telling Lilith the truth was tantamount to handing her a dagger, and telling her to pretend he was Caesar. Lucifer shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "It passes the time." Lily's grin widened. "Well, you know what they say. The devil finds work for idle hands." "Do they?" "Not mine. Next week I'll have my hands full corrupting Raphael's little gift. After that, I'll be back at work, taking over the world." Lilith's eyes glowed. "So on Saturday, you should be sick of her, and I can take Melody Angel down to level 7 to have some real fun with her." Luce considered her for a moment. A week was more than it would take to corrupt most angels. A day at most. "Sure," he said, dismissing her. "When she goes to hell, I'll make sure she's sent to level 7. He felt a strange twinge in his chest at the thought of Mel going to hell. Almost as if he didn't want to send her there, or taint her at all. He dismissed the thought as easily as he dismissed Lily. He was the devil. His sole purpose was to tempt angels and humans into revealing their true tainted natures, until he commanded an army large enough to retake heaven. Earth first, then heaven. Starting with Melody Angel, her perfume be damned. Because no angel could resist Lucifer, light of the morning. Once the foremost angel in heaven, now the lord of hell, but one day he'd be the highest angel in heaven again. He knew it in his very soul. He defeated Raphael, the general of heaven's armies. No angel or her cheap shoes would stand in his way. Or so he thought. This has been The Devil's Work. Book 1 in the Mel Goes to Hell series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google.